Well, hello world. This must be Thursday, September 10th of 2020. Welcome back to Prepping Today. Thanks for being here. I'm your host, Prepper Jay. Let's get this show underway. Today I'm here to help you with your water preps. We'll talk about different ways you can obtain water and then how you can filter and or treat it to make it safe, as well as things to consider for water storage. So let's dive right in. Water, H2O, that's two hydrogens and an oxygen, is an essential physical need. Without water, you can only survive and function for about 3 days, and thirst will start to affect your behavior and your ability to think straight long before then. Water is necessary not only for drinking, but also cooking and cleaning. 71% of the surface of the earth is covered by water, but only 2.5% is drinkable fresh water, and only 1% of that is easily accessible, with the rest trapped in places like glaciers and polar snowfields, which are rapidly melting and mixing into undrinkable ocean salt water. Civilizations first arose near water, and throughout history, practically all major cities were founded and grew around water. Vicious wars have been fought over access to water, and the United Nations has identified about 300 locations across the world where they expect conflict over water resources by the year 2025. Not that far out. In February of 2017, Pope Francis suggested we may be, quote, on the path towards a great world war over water, unquote. Major corporations are attempting to privatize water resources across the world. A former CEO of Nestle dismissed the idea of water as a human right, calling that idea extreme. As I mentioned in the last episode, in some areas of the United States, it's actually illegal to collect rain that has fallen on your own property, or restrictions are put in place for what sort of system you can use and how much you're allowed to collect and what you can use it for. I also received a viewer response from the last video, the gardening video, and she said she was not allowed to convert her turf grass lawn into a garden because she lives in a deed-restricted community with a homeowners association. Another thing HOAs often restrict is rain collection or garden water barrels. Let's see how we're looking in the chat. On both sides looking good, and we are up on Twitter. So, as always, if you have any questions or comments about this or any other prepping related subject, please feel free to post them in the live chat on whichever service you're using. We're going both on Twitch and YouTube right now. You can also find me on Twitter, at prepping_today. I've got that here live if you want to message me. And of course, you can also always email preppingtoday@protonmail.com. Now, here in the United States, there are a growing number of places where the water that comes out of the tap is not even safe to drink. The case of lead contamination in the municipal water supply for the city of Flint, Michigan, got widespread publicity, but there have also been major incidents in Washington, D.C., Pittsburgh, and Newark, as well as several others, and these have all gone on for years. Also, as of 2016, only about 90% of the nation's community water system were in compliance with all Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, standards. And even those standards have been criticized for allowing levels of contamination that are still too high for medical safety. There are also no federal standards for a variety of industrial chemicals that persist indefinitely in the environment, nor any standards for the presence of medications that pass through the bodies of humans, pets, and livestock, or are simply dumped down the drain. How are we looking? Looking good. Okay. So, what can you do to prep for your water needs? Well, starting with the basics, before you worry about how clean it is or where you can store it, you need to actually get water in the first place. Right now, wherever you are, odds are pretty good that you can just turn on a faucet and water will start flowing out. If this is true for you, please take a moment to appreciate that fact. This is a luxury the vast majority of people throughout history never had access to, and many around the world today still do not. Such a luxury is the result of society coming together to improve the standard of living for everyone. It also relies on that society remaining relatively stable. For any number of reasons, that stability might be interrupted, and you could lose that luxury. Please don't take it for granted. So let's suppose you don't have running water. Classically, you'd want to find some water somewhere. This might be a lake or a river or a small creek or pond. This is, of course, how most animals drink and how most people through history did it. This solution is easier depending on your location, such as if you're around the Great Lakes rather than if you're in the southwestern U.S., for example. You should assess what natural water resources are near you right now. If there aren't many, keep in mind that in a major event, everyone else will want to use them too. And if there are very few water resources in your area, someone might even try to control access. Alternatively, or better yet additionally, you could also gather rainwater. If you have a plastic sheet or tarp, you can form it into a funnel to catch rain over a wider area and channel it into a container. This can be done at a campsite if you've been forced to bug out. Another approach is to use a black plastic garbage bag or a contractor bag. You put it over the end of a tree branch, wrap it fairly tightly, and leave it overnight. Humidity from the leaves should accumulate and pool inside the plastic. There won't be a lot, but it's something. This technique works better for some trees than others, some locations better than others, and some times of year better than others. For example, if there aren't any leaves on the tree, it won't do you any good at all. Stick to deciduous trees, that is to say not evergreens like pine trees. If you have a home and are bugging in, which in most cases that's what you'd be doing, you could have gutters along your roof and channel water into barrels. Good rain catchment systems have a first flush arrangement that discards the first bit of water, which likely has bird poop and bug carcasses and leaves and such, until the roof has been rinsed off, and then the rest is diverted into a barrel. More advanced systems have multiple barrels, where the first barrel is allowed to fill and then overflow into a second barrel through a connecting pipe. This allows any sediments and such in the first barrel to settle down and only the cleaner water to pass through into the second barrel. This can be chained into 3 or 4 barrels to increase storage capacity. Also, if you're bugging in, or if you have an established bug-out location, and you happen to be fortunate enough to have your own well, you should be able to pump water. Just make sure you can still do so without electricity. Of course, if you live in a more northern latitude, during the winter, you'll likely have piles of water right outside your door in the form of snow and ice. You'll want to melt this, and if you're not already freezing yourself, you probably have some form of heat you can use. Just remember to stay away from the yellow snow. How's our chats looking? Good, good. Okay. So you've bugged out and you found a cute little stream and the water looks nice and clear, or maybe you have a brook running through your property, or your bug out location is your vacation cabin on a secluded little lake. You've got all the water you could ever need, right? That's great, truly. But unfortunately these days, drinking water straight from a natural source is just not as safe as it used to be. Chemical pollutants fall from the sky with rain or snow and run off from fields, collecting in lakes, and building up as rivers join together on their way to the ocean. Pesticides and herbicides, excess fertilizer, oil and gasoline, heavy metals, all of these have accumulated in natural water supplies. Additionally, of course, there are biological contaminants, including parasites, protozoa, bacteria, and viruses. There are a few techniques for dealing with this problem. You can try to filter the water, or you can add chemicals to treat it, or zap it with high-energy ultraviolet light, or boil it. One of the quickest and easiest ways to clean water is to run it through a filter of some kind. You can make a basic filter with a 5-gallon bucket or a large plant pot or some similar container, even something as small as a soda bottle if that's all you have. The basic idea is filling the container with alternating layers of materials you can gather, and then you pour water onto the top and let it work its way down through the materials and drip out the bottom into another container as clean water, or at least cleaner water. There are many different variations on this idea, with suggested materials such as pebbles or gravel, coarse and fine sand, charcoal, moss, grass, and twigs. These materials are kept from falling out the bottom by a piece of cloth from a t-shirt or a cheesecloth or a coffee filter or two. This simple, effective design, the simplest form, is just 3 layers. The top layer is pebbles or gravel, The middle layer would be sand, and the bottom layer would be crushed charcoal. You can repeat layers multiple times in taller filters. And it's good to remember this in case you ever need it. But if disaster hasn't struck yet, and you have a little money to invest, you should really just consider buying a filter. I've already recommended the Sawyer Mini water filter, and you can go watch my detailed explanation of that back in the very first episode. These are small and portable and very versatile, and you can get one for only about $20, sometimes less if they're on sale. There are also large countertop filters, such as a popular line from Berkey, if you have a few $100s to put toward one. These can work fairly slowly, but they are capable of filtering extremely small molecular contaminants, including chemicals like fluoride, chloramine used in municipal water treatment, pharmaceuticals, pesticides, and heavy metals like lead and mercury. They then hold the filtered water in a reservoir, so it's ready when you need it. There are also many different filter options in between those two extremes, but the basic idea is the same. You could even get a water filter system installed under your kitchen sink, such as a reverse osmosis system, or you can get a system for your entire household. There are also less expensive filters that attach to your kitchen faucet or are built into pitchers that you keep in your fridge. These can be fairly effective, though not always, especially if the filters aren't changed as often as they should be. You can get an inexpensive meter to measure contaminant levels in water. They give you a rough count in parts per million, or ppm. They can't tell you what the contaminants are, though. They are cheap and imperfect, but they can give you a rough idea of how clean your water actually is. You can compare your tap water to a bottle of distilled water, for example. You want to take your measurements at the same temperature for consistency. I got this for about $10, but it's been a number of years. The price may have gone up since then. It's fairly likely. But they're pretty inexpensive. Now, sometimes, after running water through cheap or old faucet or pitcher filters, you'll actually end up with a higher ppm count than the very same water had before you ran it through the filter. Something to keep in mind. How are we looking here? All right. Now, rather than filtering water, another option is chemical treatment. This is particularly effective for killing microorganisms, but keep in mind you're adding something to your water, not actually removing anything, so any chemical contamination is still there. If you're good at chemistry, you might be able to identify chemical contaminants and figure out what you could add to get those chemicals to react and precipitate out, and that counts as chemical treatment. This could potentially be very useful to a local community in the aftermath of a large-scale, longer-term disaster, if you have access to the equipment and chemicals you need. But in most cases, this is just about killing anything living in the water that might make a person sick. There are a few options for this type of chemical treatment. The first is iodine. Iodine is quite effective at killing bacteria and viruses, though it's less effective at protozoa such as Giardia, and not effective against Cryptosporidium. Giardia and Cryptosporidium are protozoa that are the biggest concern in natural water sources in North America. There are also a fair number of people with an iodine allergy, and it also shouldn't be used for pregnant women or anyone with thyroid problems. It also isn't for regular long-term use. Another classic option is chlorine. This is about as effective as iodine without the medical concerns. A somewhat better option is chlorine dioxide. This is as effective against bacteria and viruses as iodine or regular chlorine, but it's also pretty good against protozoa including both Giardia and Cryptosporidium. You can buy chlorine dioxide tablets or bottles of liquid meant for camping, which are lightweight and pack well into a bug-out bag. However, one downside of these chemical treatments is the fact that they can take a long time. Once you add them to your water, you'll need to wait a minimum of 15 minutes, but usually at least half an hour, and killing Cryptosporidium can take up to 4 hours. Another downside is they're not generally a long-term option. They can be useful for a few days to a few weeks, and depending on which chemical and what form it's in, they may not remain potent in storage for very long. Standard liquid bleach, for example, is only effective for 6 to 18 months. And your bug-out bag supply of chlorine dioxide might be good for 30 gallons, but once you run out, you're up the creek, as it were. That said, there are devices such as the MSR SE200 chlorine generator. You need some water, salt, and electricity, and it can make chlorine for you. On YouTube, both the Urban Prepper and Canadian Prepper have done good in-depth video reviews of this device, and they're both worth checking out. Another good option for a longer-term supply is calcium hypochlorite, commonly known as pool shock. Standard liquid bleach is sodium hypochlorite, but calcium hypochlorite is available in a dry, granular form and has even more available chlorine, and you can add water to it, or add it to water, to make your own bleach. You can then use that bleach to chemically treat water. 1 pound of dry granular calcium hypochlorite can treat thousands of gallons of water, just 1 pound. Pool shock can remain potent on the shelf for at least 10 years or much longer, but can be hazardous and needs to be stored properly. I'd recommend transferring it out of its original container into a clean glass jar with a plastic lid. You can get plastic lids for mason jars, and one wide-mouth quart jar is pretty much perfect for 1 pound of pool shock. And be absolutely sure you label it well. Label it properly, preferably with your mixing instructions. We'll get to that in a bit here. Whenever you work with it, be sure you're outside or in a very well-ventilated area. It's a good idea also to wear a mask and gloves. It can be pretty nasty stuff. You definitely don't want to mix other things with it. It can react pretty strongly. You can get flames and bad times. So be careful with it. A more high-tech alternative to chemical treatment is ultraviolet or UV treatment. This uses high-energy ultraviolet light to kill microorganisms without adding anything into the water. However, of course, this approach does require electricity, and like chemical treatment, it only sterilizes the water but doesn't remove any contaminants, so it should be used in combination with a filter. How are we looking here? Good, good. Now, of course, you might be thinking, what's with all these filters and chemicals and UV lights? Can't I just boil water to make it safe? Well, yes, if you're able to boil water, definitely do so. Make sure you build up a rolling boil for at least 5 minutes, and you should kill pretty much anything in it. That said, boiling takes time and resources, which you may not have, especially if you're bugging out. You would need to stop somewhere, build a fire. That requires gathering materials. It's a production to just boil water when you could just drop a tab into your canteen and wait a bit. That's the advantage of the chemical treatment for bugging out. Also like chemical treatment, boiling kills microorganisms but doesn't necessarily remove anything from the water, such as chemical contamination. Chemicals that boil at a temperature lower than water may evaporate away, at least if you don't have a lid covering your pot. But other chemicals that boil at a temperature higher than water will remain in the water, and as you boil and some of that water escapes as steam, those other chemicals are actually becoming more concentrated. There's the same amount of contaminant, but it's mixed in with less and less water. Now, you can actually take advantage of the different boiling points of these chemicals. If you have a big pot of water and you believe it may have chemical contaminants in it, you can bring it up to a good rolling boil without any lid on it and let that go for a few minutes. Then, put a lid on, but offset at a bit of an angle, so it starts to catch steam. And on the underside of the lid, water should start to bead up and flow sideways and downward and start dripping. You can move this dripping edge over toward another container. The water that drips into that second container should be pure, clean water. This is a long, slow, inefficient process, and you'll lose a lot of water to steam, and your arm will start to hurt, but it will do the job. As the water level in the first pot gets too low, you should stop this process and assume that that last bit of water has the remaining concentrated chemical contaminants. This is essentially a very crude form of distillation. A proper still, or even one roughly assembled from junk, would do a better job. If you want to make your own distilled water, there are countertop devices you can buy, though of course they require electricity. You could make more of an investment into a proper still, which would also give you the option to distill things other than water, such as ethanol for sanitation and medicinal purposes. This may not currently be legal in your area, so if it's something that interests you, you should check into your local laws. Good. Now let's talk storage. One of the very first actions you should take for preparedness in general is to find some kind of container that will hold water and fill it up. Use a pitcher, use an old soda bottle, an empty milk jug, a jar, whatever you have. Just make sure it's clean and then fill it up with water. If you don't have water from your own tap, get it from someone else's. Just have some water supply on hand. If you don't have any water stored at all, I want you to go do this right now. This is important. Go do it. Now, the universal guidance for an absolute minimum amount of water to store is 3 gallons per person per day. That's 1 gallon per person per day for 3 days. If you have 4 people in your family, that's 4 times 3 gallons, so 12 gallons. If you have a store near you that sells gallon jugs of purified water, you can buy 12 of those for about $12. The price may be a little different in your area. I believe they've gone up briefly. They may have come back down in recent weeks, but for a little while there it was almost like toilet paper. So, all right, tuck those away somewhere and you've got enough clean water set aside to get your family through about 3 days. Whatever might happen, that can either get you through it or help buy you time to figure out what you're going to need to do. The American Red Cross and other organizations recommend storing enough supply of not just water, but also food and medications and other essentials to cover a period of not only 3 days, but 2 full weeks. At 1 gallon per person per day, for a family of 4 over 14 days, that's 56 gallons. For about $100, you can get a 55-gallon barrel, and that would basically cover that. When one of these barrels is full, it weighs hundreds of pounds, so put it in a corner somewhere it can stay. If you have it in a basement or a garage or something, be sure you don't set it directly on cement or concrete. Put a panel of wood under it or something as a barrier, just make sure it's level. Cement can interact with the plastic of the barrel and end up contaminating your water. It's not a big risk, but it is a thing, so may as well do it right. You can use regular tap water or filtered water if you want to go the extra mile, but either way, you should give it a simple chemical treatment before you close it up. You can buy inexpensive water treatment chemicals marketed specifically for this purpose, or you can use a simple bleach solution, which again, you can make out of your pool shock if you wanted to. Treating it this way, you should have water that's good stored there for 5 years. If nothing has happened 5 years later, cycle it out with a new batch. It's an afternoon project and you're good to go for another 5 years. If you have some warning of an imminent disaster, it's a good idea to plug your bathtub and start filling it up. This can give you a quick 60 to 100 gallons or so, depending on your particular tub. If you do end up filling your tub, be sure to use only cold water. Why not hot water? Because if you have a water heater tank, that's another water reserve. Water heater tanks are often tens of gallons. Ours is 40. I know there are some that are only 20 or 30, some that are 60. There are also some on-demand water heaters where it heats the water as it comes into the house, so there's no reservoir tank. Those are becoming increasingly popular, but that doesn't do you any good for these purposes. So look into what you have, learn how to use it. All right. Yeah, you should learn how to access your water heater tank if you don't already know. In fact, in the lead up to an incoming disaster or shortly after one has occurred that might impact your water supply, you should shut off the water input to your water heater so it doesn't take in any contamination. A somewhat less appealing source is the tank of your flushing toilet. Not the bowl, don't use that, but the upper tank reservoir. Older toilets from before 1982 could hold 5 to 7 gallons. Middle-aged toilets until 1993 might only hold about 3.5 gallons. and the newest models often only hold about 1.5 gallons. It isn't much, but it's certainly better than nothing. Of course, you should filter and boil it first to be safe, but ultimately it's just the same as your tap water, and it could get you by in a desperate situation. Hadn't thought of the hot water tank as storage. Nice. Well, it is storage, but I wouldn't count on it as your storage. Like I say, I would think of it as bonus. So if you've got a family of 4, you're planning for 2 weeks, try to get something like that 55-gallon barrel, or maybe get a few. They make stackable water bricks or blocks or like rectangular buckets that you can fill up, and those are easy to transport versus the 55-gallon barrels. Those barrels, once you put them in place and fill them up, that's where they're going to stay until you empty it out completely. But those smaller 5-gallon transportables, those are good if you're going to evacuate or that kind of thing. So something to think about. It's an option. There's definitely a large market for these things. Lots of different designs, so the prices all vary. Something to look into. So, all right. Are we here? Good. Now, of course we understand that water is necessary for life, but just as important as getting clean, fresh water into your body is for your body to be able to use it properly. One of the most common killers in austere settings is diarrhea. You might be drinking plenty of clean water, but if your body isn't absorbing it, you can still suffer from dehydration. Once again, I'm not your doctor, and you should consult your own before taking any medical advice. That said, you should at least be aware of a medication called loperamide. It's available as a cheap generic, usually just marketed as antidiarrheal. Let's see. It's good to have on hand, just to minimize the risk. You should also be aware of oral rehydration salts, or ORS. Your body actually needs certain minerals to be able to use water properly, and you can add these to your drinking water to help fight dehydration. You can buy single-serving ORS packets like these. There's several packets in each one of these boxes, and I got 3 different flavors. The idea being if someone were suffering from an illness and needed to replenish themselves, these are the kind of things that are used in austere settings around the world. So that would be a good option. You can also make your own. The World Health Organization and UNICEF have published official guidelines for manufacturing ideal ORS, though in a pinch you can approximate it with fairly common kitchen items, including sugar, table salt, baking soda, and citric acid. If you have potassium chloride, which is a common substitute for table salt, usually used by those concerned with heart health, this is an even better option than regular table salt alone. You ideally would have both sodium chloride, the table salt, and potassium chloride. There are certain products on the market. I believe New Salt is actually a combination of both. New Salt is NuSalt. So, something to check into. Another less than ideal alternative are sports drinks like Gatorade or Powerade. These are far from perfect, but decent for the task if that's all that's available. You can buy large canisters of sports drink powder, and they'll keep on your shelf for years. If nothing else, they'd be good for variety, or to mask the taste of medicines like unflavored standard ORS. If you happen to have them on hand, products such as Pedialyte can also fill this role, though I wouldn't recommend stocking them just for your preps. They're relatively expensive and take up a lot more space than just ORS packets do. So, good. All right, so let's check out the news. There's always a lot going on, right? Anything interesting this week? Let's see. 10 states across the western U.S. are experiencing an unprecedented wildfire season, with more acres already burned than any year on record. And this season hasn't even peaked yet. At least 10 people have died, and over 3,000 homes have been destroyed so far, with tens of thousands of people displaced in evacuations. Skies along the coast have filled with particulates from the smoke, coloring them red and orange. similar to the devastating and likewise unprecedented Australian wildfires this past January. The Democrats and Republicans in the U.S. Congress still remain deadlocked in their negotiations for a second economic stimulus package, with the $1,200 stimulus checks that had bipartisan support now removed from the most recent Republican package. Congress must also pass a federal budget to avoid a government shutdown on October 1st, with the House of Representatives currently scheduled to go into recess on October 2nd and not expected back in Washington until after the election. African swine fever has been confirmed in Germany. The case was identified in samples taken from the corpse of a wild boar in the eastern state of Brandenburg. This discovery has already impacted sales of German pork products. South Korea has banned imports of pork from Germany, and negotiations are reportedly underway with China. So that's all good news, right? Just keeps getting better. Let's do some gear review. If you get some kind of warning of an incoming disaster, or one has just occurred and it may affect your water supply, I said it's a good idea to plug and fill your bathtub. It's an even better idea to line it first with something like a water bob. This is essentially a giant plastic bag that you fill up in your bathtub. Even if you keep your tub fairly clean, odds are still good it's got at least some soap scum residue, as well as bacteria and mold growth. And anyway, if you fill your tub and just leave water sitting there for several days, having that wide exposed surface of standing water will encourage the growth of algae and bacteria. Using a water bob or something similar helps keep your water clean and safe. These are fairly popular in hurricane country. They're meant for a single use, though people do dry them out and reuse them. I haven't heard of anyone getting sick and dying from water they drank from a reused water bob, but then again, they wouldn't be around to tell anyone, so. Good. All right. The book for the week. The book I'm recommending this week is The Prepper's Water Survival Guide by Daisy Luther. This is, I'm not going to say comprehensive, but it certainly covers a lot of ground, and it has a lot of good reference material in it. There are tables and charts for how much of what you'll need to mix in to do this, that, or the other thing, whether you're using chlorine dioxide or iodine, or if you're making pool shock into bleach, and then how much bleach do you use for how much water to treat it. It's all in the book. It talks about other concerns, what can happen with if you get an infection like Giardia or Cryptosporidium, what kind of symptoms to look out for, what you can do about it. It's all in there. Like again, The Prepper's Water Survival Guide by Daisy Luther. That is this week's recommendation. So, last call here. We are looking good. All right. So that's our show. I hope you all found it useful, or at least entertaining. If you did, please consider joining our Patreon to support the show. That's patreon.com/preppingtoday. I've got some rewards posted there, but let me know if you have any ideas for others. You can email me at preppingtoday@protonmail.com, or find me on Twitter. That's @prepping_today. I'll be back next time. I've been your host, Prepper J, and now more than ever, get prepping today. Thank you very much for watching. Stay safe and healthy out there. Keep the lights on.